More abundant, more love, more joy, everything.
It's inspired young people.
Inspiration comes from within you. When you clear out the garbage that's in your mind, you then create space for something better, more beautiful to come in.
Let's have life and have it more abundantly.
I say yes.
It's like taking a workshop. I get to be in my pajamas.
We have a very active imagination, which is why it's important to learn how to harness it and then point it in the direction you want to go.
I listen to your show every day.
It's time now for Living Your Inspired Life with Susan Burrell. Susan is no-nonsense, inspirational, motivational, and fun.
This is positive talk radio.
Practical wisdom for everyday life.
It's a gift you give yourself.
Now, here's Susan.
Welcome to Living Your Inspired Life. I'm Susan Burrell, and we are here once a week every Sunday on News Talk 1590 KVTA, and I invite you all to go to the website, livingyourinspiredlife.org, and check out all the good work we've been doing. We're also running an Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign to source Living Your Inspired Life so we can keep having positive talk radio on the airwaves here in Ventura County. So go to the website, livingyourinspiredlife.org, check out the work we're doing, and check out the Indiegogo campaign. And I really encourage you to contribute to positive talk radio on the airwaves. So with that said, one of the things that is one of the cornerstones of living your inspired life is this idea of conscious business, conscious environment, and conscious evolution. And we're always talking about collaboration and co-creation and cooperation. And so I am, as always, deeply grateful because I have a young man in the studio who is very passionate about the work he does, and it is about conscious environment. So I want to welcome Connor Jones of Ojai Permaculture on the show today. Connor, thanks for everything that it took to get here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to be here.
So you are on my radar because you are doing something that's very conscious, actually, and very supportive of the environment in general. And this is this thing called permaculture. So I'm holding my hand up, Connor. I got to say, I don't know what permaculture is.
Right. That's the first question always, right?
So what is it?
Yeah. So permaculture is a design system. It observes natural ecosystems and uses the patterns of those ecosystems to better design our resource supply lines that supports our economics, that supports our food systems. And we also use the wisdom of nature to design our lives. We look at the complex yet seemingly effortless interactions of natural ecologies to design how we interact with one another and with our environment. So what I like to say to my students and what I bear in mind is permaculture is about creating the human habitat.
So, I love that.
Yeah, so when we think about a habitat and we think about one creature in its habitat, being in its habitat, it is provided with all of its needs, right? And so through the course of its life, receiving what it needs from its surroundings, its actions, without thought, also support everything else around it that is supporting it. And so my question is to everybody is, what does that look like for us?
For human beings?
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess I have to talk, excuse me, from what it looks like for me. And it looks like for me that I have a sprinkler system. I'm thinking about gardening right now.
Right.
And that's all I got. I got a sprinkler system. And with the drought that's on right now in California, it's driving me bonkers trying to figure out how do I keep my landscape living and sourced enough and yet not abuse the water that we just have.
Right.
So can you speak to that?
Yeah. Agriculture and food production is a major component of permaculture, but for clarity, permaculture extends beyond that. But this is the focus that many people have entering permaculture because it's the fuel for us, right?
Right.
So when we're thinking about obtaining a yield from a land-based system, growing food, right? One of the biggest, or if not the biggest, consumer of fresh water is agriculture on a large scale.
Right.
So permaculture really calls into question the necessity for it. Because if we as people made the switch from consumers to producers
Yes.
of our food resources just as a start, we could dramatically reduce the state's use of water, right?
Okay, say
And
that
so
again.
if-
To move from consumer to
producer, we could dramatically reduce the state's use of water for crop production, right? We're talking about these commodity crops that take a lot of water to produce, and they're looking for consistent yield. They're looking for symmetry in all of the plants, in their products. So there's a lot that gets wasted. But if we can grow these things in our backyard with the irrigation water that we'd otherwise be using for ornamental landscapes, and also value all of the yield instead of sorting through it and throwing away half of it because it doesn't match what we're expected to see in a supermarket, then we can greatly reduce waste of water and of precious food that is the product of putting water on the soil.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So there is in our town of, there is a brand new market in town. And every time I walk in, the way that it is being showcased, is look at this plethora of abundance of food. And in the pit of my stomach, I feel ill because at the end of every day, really how much of that food is being bought, is being purchased. And then I'm wondering what happens to that food at any grocery store when the produce is not. There's no way that fresh food can all be bought in one day. So do you have an answer or a solution for that?
Right. Well, that's where, again, we call into question the necessity for large-scale production like that because it is associated with so much waste.
Oh, God.
And the current model right now doesn't have a use for that. And waste is an idea. Waste is not actually a real thing. There's no waste in natural systems. Waste is the unused output of a system, right? So we need to become intelligent with our yields, right? Because we're losing 30 to 40% of what we yield from agriculture. So some of the things that we've done at our permaculture demonstration site in Ojai called East End Eden was we take food waste from restaurants, from the farmer's market, and from various other places, any resources that we can tap and take out of the waste stream, we bring back to our farm and we compost it, or we'll feed it to our poultry or our pigs or whatever animals really love these things that would otherwise be going to waste. And we upcycle it into other things or into soil nutrients. And I think that that's something that could be adopted throughout the state because, by the way, California produces over 90% of the U.S.'s commodity crops. So this drought doesn't just affect us, it affects the entire nation.
Wow, I did not realize that.
Yeah. And so back to the home garden and where we can all take action with this is designing edible landscapes, productive landscapes that can reduce our demand for more agricultural yield from our already stressed agricultural system in California. And that said, also, when you were saying when you look at this produce in the supermarket, you feel this not so good feeling. Well, try going to those agricultural fields and look at it, right? Because that is not such a good feeling to be there because you literally have to destroy complex ecosystems to create monoculture crops.
Yeah, we're surrounded by it here in the Ventura County area.
And organic is nice, but it's still, you have to take out ecological function and reduce it down to a few different crops.
Okay,
right?
what does that mean in layman terms, Connor?
Right. So basically, in order to set up a crop field for annuals, like the vegetables that we mainly eat, you have to destroy wetland environments, grasslands, or forests, which has thousands of species and millions of complex interactions below the soil and above the ground. And those interactions and that diversity is what provides the stability in our climate and also what provides nutrient density, right? So the the first few yields from a brand new field where they've just drained the marsh or something and
Right.
tilled it up, you get really good product. But over the years, through cultivation, plowing, and over irrigating and runoff, we start to lose that nutrient to the ocean, especially in California. And so what I'm saying is that if in our backyards we can use the model of nature, which is complex ecology and interaction and cooperation, to assemble edible landscapes, we then get a higher nutrient density product from our garden than we would ever get from even an organic farm. So we're saying we're going a step beyond organic, you know. This is backyard quality, which is higher than anything else. And plus, you put your love into it. It's an investment beyond just feeding the plants or feeding the soil, which feeds the plants, and putting things in the ground. It's you put your love and your observation into it.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to tap on that because we
Yeah.
know, and I have house plants, and I talk to them. Okay.
Yeah.
And we know that if we're all an interconnected idea, let's just put it that way. If we're all interconnected, which is what I absolutely believe, then what you just said about putting your love and your observation, your intention into the food that you're growing, it comes back to us multiplied because we are all interactive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we're missing a vital component of healthy living, which is interacting with ecosystems and seeing ourselves as part of it.
Right.
Right. We have this sort of humanistic complex where we see ourselves as separate from nature. Everything else has a habitat except us, which brings me back to my original statement. So if we can create a habitat for ourselves that feeds us, that we nurture, and it's a symbiotic interaction, then we reap so much more than just food. There's this fulfillment, this you feel this. It's a different kind of being full after your meal. It's this spiritual fulfillment, and you just feel good.
Yeah.
And we need to get back to the garden. We need to get ourselves back into interaction with what sustains us, and it just changes your whole lens of perception.
Okay, so I have another question for you, Connor Jones of Ojai Permaculture. I'm a very busy person.
Yes.
There's lots of very busy people
Yes.
that work in offices and or businesses and or blah, blah, blah. And the idea of coming home and then doing more work,
Right.
even though it like what you're saying, it becomes that place of connection. I know there's lots of people that are like, no, let me just run to the supermarket, grab
Sure.
something for dinner.
Well, I would ask the question, what are you doing on the weekend? Because here's the thing.
I'm drinking wine.
Well, okay. So I like drinking wine and working in the garden too. But here's the thing. We're familiar with food production coming from larger scale farms, right? Which when you destroy the complex interactions that occur in a natural ecosystem, you make more work for yourself, right? So we're putting things in the right places where even the plants that we are putting in the ground are going into a habitat where their needs are met by the things surrounding them, and they assist the other things that assist them. So we're not just putting ourselves in our habitat, we're also putting all these plants that have been developed for over 10,000 years by our ancestors together in a symbiotic assembly so that it cuts down on the work for the gardener. And
Wait, how does that happen, really? I'm just trying. Are you
Yeah.
talking about like ladybugs and and bees
so
and stuff
so
too?
here's a simple example
Okay.
that is really kind of what gets people turned on to permaculture, and it's the concept of a food forest, right? So we think of growing fruit or nuts, we think of orchards, right? Which is
Right.
acres and acres of the same tree. But what permaculture does is takes an objective for getting a yield and assembles the right pieces together so you get multiple yields from one system. So a permaculture food forest is an assembly of all kinds of different plants that mimics a forest, the 7 layers of the forest, right? But assembled with all things that you can get a yield from, right? So we're doing all the layers, and every single thing is something you like to eat.
Okay, so is that on your website? Like if I wanted to start a small garden, like one
Yeah.
row of something,
Uh-huh.
or maybe two, I
Right.
think I could do that. Do you have something on your website that I could go, okay, I'm going to plant lettuce that goes with the tomatoes, that goes with the carrot or whatever?
Well, there's a lot of information about companion planting for vegetables, what specific things like to be together. But for larger establishments of food forests, I teach workshops, and I have like 1-day skills workshops that I post up on the website, ojaipermaculture.com. And so if you're interested in that, tune into the website, and we have, we're getting into a pretty regular cycle of different skills where we just take one day and we really hone in on designing a food forest, for example.
Okay, so does the food in designing a food forest, let's just tease this out a little bit more. Does that mean that you're starting with the soil?
Yes.
Okay. And so like what goes in the soil, Connor?
Yeah. So
Earthworms. I don't know.
Okay, so when we think of soils, right, the context that we're working with most of the time for people who want to have a home garden is that the soils are very compacted, because you actually have to compact the soil around a house legally.
Yeah.
So we're starting with a deficient situation. So what we use is nature's model, which is building soil from the top down. So you add organic matter, you add mulch, just like the forest, right? All of the leaf litter that falls from the trees and plants goes right down to the ground, where the fungi and the microorganisms in the soil break it down and structure it into that rich black soil that is fertility. And so we replicate that by using anything that is locally or freely available that is biodegradable and put it down over that bare or compacted soil, and we turn it into a living soil that can then give rise to these food plants that we want to grow. And so one of the common techniques is sheet mulching, which actually uses things that would be trash, like cardboard or newspaper or even magazines, and all of those things can go back.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm. If
It
it's
doesn't
lived
have to go in
before,
my
it can live
recycle.
again.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like that. I guess I better pull out that cardboard I just put in my recycle bin.
Yeah, worms actually love the little corrugated sections in cardboard. They
Of
live
course
in
they
there,
do.
and then the fungal mycelium, which is the root system of fungi, spreads throughout it and digests it. And there may be some minimal toxins in there, but they're actually over time locked up in the soil carbon that you build and become inert.
Okay, do I have to shred all that stuff, or can I just lay down a thing of cardboard?
You can lay down a thing of cardboard, and then you can put, like in Ojai, for example, we have an excess of horse manure. So you could put horse manure over that and then put a layer of wood chips over the top, so it looks nice and consistent throughout the yard. It's not a hodgepodge of different trashy looking things.
Oh.
So you just blanket the soil with things that can break down. And in theory, what you're doing is forwarding about 1,000 years of soil building, because it takes, in natural systems, it can take over 1,000 years to build an inch of topsoil. But with us, with our ingenuity and resources now, even tapping into waste streams, we can do 1,000 years worth of soil building in an afternoon with our friends.
And then how long does it take before you can actually plant? Because I'm seeing the cardboard and then the horse manure
Right.
and then
Yeah. So
do I have to wait a year for that to be?
You don't. You can wet that down. It's good to time it with rain too. So all
hello,
that stuff gets
California.
hydrated. Hey, it does rain.
Oh, yeah.
Let's not forget.
All right.
We don't. It's just the fact that we get about 30% of our rain in one day. But we got to have timing with it. But we can also irrigate that material. We just need to hydrate it, and then you can spike straight through the cardboard and the mulch and plant right into that. And as those plants are growing, all that material you put down is decaying and beginning to start the web interactions in the soil that feed your plant. So we can start right away.
Okay, this is a sideways question,
Sure.
but it is. I have a dog.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what do I do with the dog? Can
Yeah.
I use that instead of horse manure?
You can, yeah.
But I don't want to go digging in that.
Well, it takes a different style of decay for that, of composting. So what I would do for that is start a worm bin. which is a pretty simple thing to do. In fact, we use old bathtubs at our farm to start them because it drains well. But you fill a well-drained container with cardboard, shredded paper, straw, high carbon materials that break down. And then you add worms, and you can come over to East End Eden and pick up worms anytime you like. And you start them in there, and they start to colonize all that material. And then you can add the dog poop to that. And there have been tests where E. coli has been cultured in petri dishes at its ideal temperature and conditions, and then observed under a microscope after one of these red worms, these compost worms, was dropped into the petri dish, and the bacterial biofilm on the worm actually starts killing the E. coli on contact and eating it.
Oh my gosh.
So we can partner with biology to remediate these potential pathogens and turn things like dog poop into a soil resource.
Oh my gosh.
Nature's powerful.
Yes, it is. And I'm so grateful that I got to ask that question because every week I'm like, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
What do I do with this? And so then the other part of composting, okay, that now again, I'm talking as a consumer.
Sure.
You know, so every day I make myself a salad, and there's leftover avocado peels and cored out bell peppers and you know, lemons, and so
feed it to the worms.
So I'm going to put it in my container with the dog poop, or I'm going to lay it on top of the cardboard sheet and the wood chips?
You can do either or, but I would say since you will have a steady supply of a small amount of compost material every day, I would set up your worm bin and feed those things to the worms because they love all those veggie scraps. And what you then yield from that is far greater than what you would yield from just putting it on the soil or in your mulch mix, because worm castings are just about the best fertilizer nature provides. And so if you're turning all of your veggie scraps into your fertilizer for the garden throughout the rest of the growing season, then it's a good use of that waste resource.
So how long do I have to wait before I can utilize that stuff as a fertilizer?
Well, it's a sensory experience, right? When you go digging through your worm bin.
I'm just imagining how it smells right now, to be honest.
Well, once a worm bin is established, it shouldn't smell any different than digging around in the forest floor. It should smell like rich earth. And you can tell that it's ready when the soil that they've created in there by decaying all of that stuff and digesting it is like this soft, fluffy, black, compost. It should look like compost and it should smell good. One of the things in permaculture, I've heard this saying used a few times, if it smells bad, something's wrong.
Really?
Right? Yeah, so the only time your worm bin might smell bad is if it's not draining well and it's not getting enough oxygen. Same with your compost pile. If it smells, it's gone anaerobic and you're growing organisms that aren't necessarily beneficial. So you want to make sure all of these decompositions that you're creating to produce soil smell good all the way through their process.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's interesting because when I was getting ready for our conversation today, I'm going to be going to the Sequoias soon. And so I was looking up some stuff about John Muir. And so I just want to bring in a couple of quotes because from John Muir, because it fits in with what we're talking about here.
Yeah, great.
I had no idea about John at this point. But one of the things he said is that there is not a fragment in all nature. For every relative fragment of one thing is a full harmonious unit in itself, which is what you're talking about with the worm castings and the dog stuff and the cardboard and everything. Everything can be utilized because it's all interconnected.
Exactly.
I love that. So I want to ask you, Connor Jones, what called you to do this kind of work? Because you're a very young man and you are, just talking to you, you're very dedicated to this. So what called you to do this?
Well, I would say for one, my whole life I've had a fascination with natural systems and ecology. Even as a child, and I think most kids are
Yeah.
actually really interested in what's going on in nature. When we arrive on this earth from our birth, we want to know what's going on, right? And I had a particularly strong calling to do so. And so I've always gathered plants and animals, especially when I was 6, 7, and 8 years old, and I would bring them together in aquariums and terrariums or in the backyard and try to put together and reassemble ecosystems to understand them. And then I would garden with my dad, and we would go down to the wetland at the end of the road when we lived down in Huntington Beach, and I just loved to be in nature and try to understand what was going on. And when I got a little bit older, I started raising chickens and I started growing more food, and then self-sufficiency started to interest me. And it wasn't really until my senior year in high school, where I was in an Algebra 2 class that I was really uninterested in because I had taken it a couple times already. And I was leaning back in my chair, and the chair gave out, and I hit my head on a bookshelf that was behind me. And this classroom was it was a geology and earth science classroom that was also hosting the Algebra 2 class. Anyway, I turned around, and right away my attention was drawn to this thin, sort of tattered-looking green-spined book, right? It was like this moment of divine providence. Where it was like, here's what you're doing, because all my peers knew which college they were going to or what they were doing next, and I had just left it open-ended. And so I turn around and I pull this book out, and I look at the cover image, which is a hand-drawn sort of caricature-like design of a permaculture farm where the chicken really pops out so you can see where it is in relative location to the house, and where you would put the cattle and the food forest and the bees and the pond and the spiral earth mound around the house to buffer the wind. And it was like, oh my goodness, this is all of these seemingly scattered interests I had growing up put together in one system of design. So from that point forward, I was able to structure all of my interests into something that could be a lifestyle and a livelihood for me, and what I feel also is the solution to this current Earth crisis that we're in. And so for me, there was no question after that point what I was doing.
Yeah, talk about... I call that a God said. And God said, this is what you're doing.
Exactly.
That's amazing to me. Mm-hmm. So I'm talking to Connor Jones. He is the inspiration for Ojai Permaculture.com, and it's Ojai Permaculture.com. You're listening to Living Your Inspired Life. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Susan Burrell from Living Your Inspired Life. I always find it easier and more fun to expand my life by being connected to open-hearted, like-minded people committed to being on the same path I am. If you feel the same way, I suggest you visit a Center for Spiritual Living. There are wonderful communities in Ventura, Ojai, Santa Barbara, Oxnard, Pleasant Valley, Camarillo, and Westlake Village. You'll find terrific people, great information, and more tools to help you live the life you were born to live. So go to csl.org to find a center near you. That's csl.org for a center near you.
Welcome back to Living Your Inspired Life. I'm Susan Burrell, and I'm having this wonderful conversation with Connor Jones, who is the creator of Ojai Permaculture. And there is a site, ojaipermaculture.com, Ojai. But before we re-enter the conversation about permaculture, I want to read another John Muir quote, because I can't even believe how this all fits together. Well, of course I can believe it. But anyway, so John Muir said, "Man must be made conscious of his origin as a child of nature. Brought into right relationship with the wilderness, he would see that he was not a separate entity endowed with a divine right to subdue his fellow creatures, and destroy the common heritage, but rather an integral part of a harmonious whole. He would see that his appropriation of Earth's resources beyond his personal needs would only bring imbalance and beget ultimate loss and poverty for all." Are you getting this? Thank you, John Muir. And that's what we're talking about, right, Connor? That's the state of the world right now, where we have kind of just been raping the land, yeah?
Yeah, I would say John Muir is a bit of a prophet.
Yes, he is.
Absolutely. That was very plain and simple. That was exactly what we're talking about. And we've seen that result. We've seen that poverty, and we've seen that imbalance. And it's time to take some of that wisdom from the people who were here before, that saw how the land was managed and saw the beauty and perfection of functional ecosystems.
Yeah, it's interesting, and this is my opinion, but watching the changes that have happened just in the Ventura County area here, where there was a lot of growing, a lot of land that was just dedicated to farming, and now a lot of those parcels have been given over to housing, continually building housing and I keep wondering, where are we going to grow our food if everything gets turned over to making money in whatever shopping mall they want to put up and stuff like that? Where's our food coming from? And that's what permaculture is all about. Yeah,
It's, for one, like, we can produce quite a bit of food from our house, right? So we might be losing agricultural land to housing, but even still, in that problem, there's always a solution. And that's kind of, that's one of the principles of permaculture, is the problem is the solution. So we have a society that's very problem orientated. We like to talk about problems. We like to entertain the negativity of our problems and create a world around problems. But there is always a solution right there in front of us if we can observe problems from a positivistic perspective, and we can observe without projection. If we just look at what's going on, take a common sense look.
Hello.
Yeah. And Bill Mollison, the man who coined the term permaculture, and I'll paraphrase, but one of his quotes was, as the problems of the world become increasingly complex, the solutions still remain embarrassingly simple.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah.
And that's true. Okay, so everybody that's listening, that's true for anything that you're facing right now. If you've got a problem that's just happening in your life, the solution is really simple. That is something I've experienced personally. And when I finally get down to the simplicity of it, I'm like, really? Really? Okay, that makes sense. So one of the things on your website that caught my attention is you're designing for drought. Now, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I just finished a workshop last weekend, which was Introduction to Permaculture, Designing for Drought, and we'll be doing another one soon. So what we're looking at is, this really big problem, so to speak, which is drought. And we have to whittle it down to the sources of this problem, because drought isn't just something that happens. Drought...
It's not, Connor? I'm raising my eyebrow. Really? It's not? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, drought on this scale is something that occurs because of mismanagement of water resources.
Okay, would you say that again so everybody can hear it?
Drought on this scale is caused by mismanagement of water resources.
And that's just not governments or that's all of us mismanaging our water.
Yeah, it's nobody's fault. It's just sort of the standard narrative of our society right now of, we design our settlements to move the free water falling from the sky off of our land as quickly as possible. There's no ethic or notion of conserving that water. So there's a huge issue, because we are in a region where we don't get a lot of rainfall compared to others, and the frequency of our rainfall is really important to observe too. Like I mentioned earlier, we can get 30% of our annual rain in one night or in one day. Or less sometimes. And so we have to design for those rain events where we get El Nino or something that happens on a cycle, right? And we can plan for those events and have water storage, either reservoirs, decentralized smaller reservoirs that don't dam up rivers, Or we can have our landscape redesigned to catch and store and infiltrate that water down into the deep groundwater reservoirs that we have, which is our aquifers, right? And so if every year we have an annual gain of water, we're infiltrating more and more and more all the time, then the wells that we have are like a straw down into our underground tank, essentially.
Right.
And that's something that we do at East End Eden, is we have our landscape designed to take the runoff from the roads, the access roads through the property, and send it out through what's called a swale. We have a series of them, and they're rainwater harvesting ditches designed on contour. So the bottom of them is completely level. So when the water enters, it doesn't really flow in any direction. It just fills up passively and infiltrates passively and recharges the perched aquifer that our well goes down into. And so every year we have this cumulative gain of groundwater instead of a loss. And so right now, if you think of water as a bank account, we've been withdrawing and we haven't been putting anything back in.
Right. So, it's interesting because a while back I saw a short video clip on rain harvesting. And this guy had decided to plant, drought-tolerant plants. But then what he did is he created trenches. And this was in the green belt, of a street. And then he put trenches around the tree to catch the water, but then he also created a little runoff spout so it would go to the next guy, the next tree, that kind of a thing. And I thought, well, you know what? That's so smart.
Exactly.
Instead of doing what are those little soaker sprinkler thingies?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, anything we can do to use the runoff resources of the hardscape landscapes that we have now, because we've paved over so much of the soil that would have received that, but we can still focus that huge amount of water that's coming off of road surfaces or rooftops and send it into basins that are designed to receive that flash flood runoff and infiltrate it. So we can work with even the current situation where we don't have as much surface area of soil. And one other thing that we should all know at this point is that soil needs to be alive to really receive water. And the soil temperature has to be lower than the air temperature for water to even go into it. And so we have so many areas of bare, scorched earth soil. And when water hits it, it runs off. And some of the rain might infiltrate an inch or two, but by the next day when the sun comes out in sunny Southern California, it's gone back up into the atmosphere. It's evaporated.
So what do you do? What do you do about that?
Mulch.
Oh, this goes back to the worm casings and stuff that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so we're talking about keeping the soil covered. We have a policy at our farm and at the other sites that I design and consult where we have zero bare soil. Right? We do not want runoff. That is, in this climate particularly, public enemy number one, water runoff, right? Because for one thing, when you have a raindrop falling from the sky at terminal velocity and it hits the bare soil surface, not only does it leave real quick, it also takes the soil with it. And our lives depend on topsoil. So if we want to sustain agricultural yields and we want to prevent flooding and erosion and drought, we have to take care of the soil and make sure that it's not leaving. And healthy soil wants to stay home. If you have healthy soil, it doesn't want to go to the ocean. It wants to stay where it is.
Right, that makes sense.
It's held there by a matrix of different living organisms that anchor it in place.
It's interesting as you're speaking, I'm thinking about my backyard because I do have a couple of bare, and it's harder than rock soil that is completely open to the sky. There's no trees on it or anything. And I'm like, oh. I look at it all the time going, what am I going to do with that? Should I put concrete on it? What should I do with it? So you're saying put cardboard and
mulch it.
Mulch it.
Yeah, and this is something that also is beneficial for dealing with weeds, right? Because we think of gardening and we're like, oh, but weeding is so challenging. It's going to make my back hurt and all this. But if you have deep mulch over the soil, the weeds don't really show up. Weeds live in that bare and degraded soil that's created through tilling or through just stripping it bare and always raking the leaves off and taking them to the landfill or to the dump or whatever. And there's actually a plan in Ojai and throughout Ventura County where the Ojai Bike Trail accesses, where for almost 30 years now they've been using herbicide to manage weeds. And I just had a meeting with Supervisor Steve Bennett about non-toxic alternatives. And what we're going to trial within the Ojai city limits is using mulch as the primary way to manage the weeds. Because the weed that's the biggest issue is puncture vine, which pops everyone's tires, also known as the goat head thorn.
Yeah, and hurts when your dogs walk on it.
Exactly. And its Latin name is Tribulus terrestris, troubled earth, right? Degraded soil. That's where it lives. It's in its name, We don't have to look too far to understand what's going on.
Right.
And so basically, when we observe the presentation of the plant, it's got a very deep taproot. It's very hard to pull out of the ground. It makes it so you don't want to walk where it grows, so it's keeping further compaction from occurring on that soil. And it grows low to cover the soil, which makes it hard to get with a weed whacker. So when all the resources or ways to deal with it have been exhausted, it comes down to, well, we just got to spray it with glyphosate, even though it's a probable carcinogen.
I'm shaking my head. I hate that stuff.
And there's way too much of it in the biosphere right now. So anything we can do to reduce that is good. But the way I broke it down for Steve Bennett and the other members that were in the room was that the problem is not the herbicide. The problem is not the county. The problem is this weed, partially, but actually the real problem is the soil condition. It's a dead soil, and this plant is trying to bring it back to life. And we can forward its process. We can speed it up and make that plant no longer necessary to be there by decompacting the soil and shading it simply by covering it with mulch, 3 inches of mulch.
That's it.
And for every 3 inches of mulch we have on the soil surface, it can hold 1 inch of rainwater.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so can I come and get mulch from your place and put it in my backyard?
Well, there's OVO, Ojai Valley Organics, as the source in Ojai, and they're doing good business now. For a while, it was slow for them, but now it's sometimes hard to actually get mulch from them. But they take the green waste from all over Ojai and turn it into a product. We produce mulch on site for our farm. We don't distribute nutrients off-site usually. But you can generate mulch in your own yard too.
Right, which we talked about earlier. So, okay, now you got me really thinking. So there's something else that a friend of mine's been talking to me about called aquaponics, and she was telling me she's moving to Arizona, and she's like, that's what I'm going to do in Arizona. I'm going to do this to grow lettuce and tomatoes, and she explained it to me, and I really didn't understand.
Yeah.
So what is it?
Aquaponics is sort of a hybrid of hydroponics and aquaculture. So hydroponics is a system where you're putting in a nutrient input into a solution, right? And it's being cycled. So it's a liquid feed for plants. But it's not necessarily sustainable. And then we have aquaculture, which is creating ponds and water bodies that grow fish, crustaceans, and edible aquatic plants. And we're putting those two things together where in our system, which is about 700 square foot, it's a building, and then we have 4 tanks in the ground, and they're each about 300 gallons. And in each of those tanks, we have catfish, we have bluegill, we have koi, we have carp, goldfish, gambusia minnows, and a whole array of different fish, right? And so when fish are fed the feed that we give them, they poop. And that's a nutrient resource. And if they didn't have filtration, they would die in that water. So the next phase is that we have a pump in there that pumps that water through a series of grow beds that are filled with this this clay pellet type material. And you could use gravel too for this. And so that water flows through there, and then we have vegetables planted in there. And their root system is in that water, and it skims the nutrients out of it. It grabs it and utilizes it. And it's an oxygenating process as well. So the plants filter and maybe even restructure the water and send it back to the fish, and it tumbles through the pipes and back in clean, clear, and oxygenated for the fish. So you get a yield of fish and vegetables from a system that recycles only about 1,000 gallons of water every day, all day. And at 700 square feet, our bed space is even smaller than that. We could feed 15 people.
Wow.
On 1,000 gallons of water recycled every day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, and this is making me think of places where they have koi ponds and things like that, that would be powerful if they were to develop systems like that to then source their landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any ornamental pond is going to have an excess of nutrient in it if it's got fish in it, particularly koi. They create a particularly nutrient-heavy water condition if it's not filtered. And this is a great way to grow these water-intensive crops that we're growing in California, like celery, for example. If you've ever tried to grow celery in your backyard, it takes a lot of water to get a celery that looks like the one you buy at the store.
Wow.
But it's just as easy as planting it in an aquaponic system because it always has unlimited access to water and nutrients, which is ideal for it.
Right.
So we can take things that are water intensive out of a land-based cultivation and into an aquaponic system, which could be done on a vacant parking lot. You could use asphalt or concrete surface to set up a system like this because it's soilless. But you're still teaming up with biology to obtain a yield. And so kind of to get a little bit more of an understanding of what it's like, it's replicating how a creek cleanses and circulates itself.
Oh, that makes sense to me now. Okay. That's very interesting. So the other thing that I wanted us to tap on is in terms of the permaculture culture. Is that redundant?
I don't think so. As many times as we can repeat the term permaculture.
Permaculture.
Yeah.
You're going to be showing, there's a film that you're going to be showing coming up on May 29th. Why don't you tell everybody about it? It's a feature-length film. That's
right. Yeah, so we're going to be screening the film Inhabit, a permaculture perspective, which is one of the first feature-length films that really presents permaculture as a solution to some of the major shortcomings that we're experiencing in our food supply system and resource supply chain. And so we're going to be showing that at the Ojai Valley Grange Hall, May 29th at 7 p.m., followed by a panel discussion. We're also going to have the producer of the film there, which we're really excited and grateful for. So I encourage anyone who's interested in what I'm talking about to show up there and engage with the community because we're going to be dialoguing about how to implement these things on a local level.
Okay. And this is going to be on ojaipermaculture.com. All the information in case you're listening and you didn't catch it.
That's right.
It's going to be on it for May 29th.
That's right.
Now, I'm sorry, as you were saying all that, I remembered there was another question I wanted to ask you really quickly because we're almost out of time.
Sure.
It's about the herbicides and stuff like that. It's about how do we, you're talking about it in terms of a cityscape, how to get rid of all of that, but also for just people growing stuff in their backyard. I know people that they have the termite guy come and spray around their house, and then they're planting their vegetable garden right there next to it. So would you speak to some of that for me?
Yeah. Well, I think for all of us, it's kind of a generally accepted thing now that we live in a pretty toxified biosphere.
It's incredibly yucky.
We're bombarded really with lots of different chemicals that are maybe tested individually for their effects on people, but never in the combination that we experience every day. And so what we need to do is start incorporating nutrient density into our diets, for one. which helps us to detoxify ourselves and prepare ourselves for this bombardment of pollution.
Okay, what do you mean by nutrient density for people that really don't comprehend?
Nutrient density comes from healthy foods that are grown in a condition where the soil is getting more and more fertile with every season. And when you dig down in the soil, you find worms, you find mycelium, which is the white-looking web network that lives in the soil. When you can see life surrounding whatever you're trying to eat, where your food's grown in an environment that feels good, it feels right. And there's testing for these things too, and technology is beginning to catch up with the leading edge of food production and ecological food production, that is. And also we're starting to understand how to team up with microbes to detoxify our biosphere and to build soil that actually locks up these contaminants. Mm-hmm. So we're getting there. And, there's a little bit of faith involved in it. I like to be pretty science-based when I make recommendations, but I do know there is some science about these toxins actually being broken down by bacteria. Glyphosate, I've heard some studies of certain organisms that actually can work on it and break it down to a...
That's actually encouraging to me, because when I see them spraying the fields and stuff, it just, oh my goodness.
Right. Yeah, there are simple solutions to these things, but it's just that our science yet hasn't reoriented itself towards looking at these kinds of solutions. It's like the oil spill that's just happened up north from us off Refugio. There could be solutions employed to that. Like, for example, straw and hay binds petroleum like that. It could be dispersed off the coast there, and the wave action would actually tumble the straw and the oil together, and then we could dredge all that back in and inoculate it with oyster mushroom mycelium, which has been proven to digest diesel fuel and other petroleum products, and turn it into soil.
Really?
Yes.
My mouth is wide open, everybody. I'm like, whoa. Okay, I love that. I love that that's cool. And that goes back to what you said earlier when we were talking about that every problem has a simple solution. It doesn't have to be hammered at by all sorts of scientists and machines and stuff like that. That's
right.
A very simple solution. I love it.
Yeah, and I encourage, science to really hammer at this and understand it thoroughly, right? Mm-hmm. And these solutions are reasonably simple, and it depends on the scale, of course.
Right.
But it's a lot simpler than what we have in our toolbox right now for dealing with environmental devastation.
Right. So I've been having a phenomenally amazing and educational for me, Connor, thank you, conversation with Connor Jones, the creator of Ojai Permaculture. And I invite everybody to go to Ojai, Ojai Permaculture.com and learn more about what you can do in your own home environment or in your own town to support a world that works for everyone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Connor. And so I'm just going to say, and so it is, namaste.